Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Happy Sunday, everybody. We have a very big episode today. Part 2 was a lot of research, which is why I've pushed it from a Saturday release to a Sunday release. But it's very important to cover, and I think it's super interesting, so I hope you do enjoy it. Before we cover the main topic in Part 2, we begin with salient updates related to US-China relations. The Biden-Xi phone call from earlier this week has marked the beginning of a new series of talks between the two sides, discussing military matters, immigration, and financial, economic, and trade affairs. This week, US military officials met their Chinese counterparts for a series of meetings in Hawaii, focused on how the two countries can operate safely. The so-called Military Maritime Consultative Agreement Working Group was the first such meeting since 2021. Beijing suspended all military dialogue with Washington in August 2022 after then US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. In an official statement published on Friday of this week, the US military said officials from both countries, quote, reviewed safety-related events over the past few years and discussed sustaining maritime and aviation operational safety and professionalism, end quote. The following day, Saturday, China's Defense Ministry published a separate statement saying that the two sides concluded, quote, candid and constructive exchanges on the US-China maritime and air security situation, end quote, but added that China also, quote, firmly opposed any attempt to endanger its sovereignty and security in the name of freedom of navigation and overflight, end quote. Colonel Ian Francis of the Indo-Pacific Command, who led the U.S. delegation, expressed, quote, open, direct, and clear communication is of utmost importance to avoid accidents and miscommunication, end quote. In recent months, the Pentagon has released declassified images and videos showing Chinese fighter jets acting in a manner the U.S. describes as, quote, coercive and risky against U.S. assets acting lawfully in international airspace over the East and South China Seas, end quote. Meanwhile, this week the US is conducting high-level discussions with China aimed at increasing the number of Chinese nationals deported from the United States. The US Homeland Security Secretary, speaking to US-based outlet NBC News on Friday, explained that such an agreement would be a breakthrough in US-China relations and American immigration policy. China has long been uncooperative with US efforts to deport Chinese citizens back to the country. The talks come as the number of Chinese nationals crossing the US-Mexico border without authorization has exploded. Customs and Border Protection logged over 24,000 such crossings in fiscal year 2023, up from just over 2,000 the previous year, a more than 11-fold increase. A spokesperson for the Chinese embassy in Washington, D.C. expressed on the talks, quote, illegal immigration is an international problem that needs the cooperation of relevant countries to solve it together. China has had good cooperation with some countries on the issue of repatriating illegal immigrants and is willing to continue to strengthen cooperation with relevant countries on this issue, end quote. The US, however, has long counted China among a list of non-cooperative countries when it comes to deportations. The current deportation process is highly expensive and logistically challenging. It is hoped that with a new agreement, this will help the process. And finally, as regular viewers know, US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is in China for a series of talks with top economic policy makers. Yesterday, as anticipated, Yellen confronted her Chinese counterpart, Vice Premier He Lifeng, about China's surging exports of inexpensive electric vehicles and other green energy goods, saying that they were a threat to American jobs and urging Beijing to scale back its industrial strategy. After the 2 days of meetings in the southern megacity of Guangzhou, Yellen told reporters, quote, I think the Chinese realize how concerned we are about the implications of their industrial strategy for the United States, for the potential to flood our markets with exports that make it difficult for American firms to compete, end quote. China, which for years has had difficulty rebalancing their economy away from subsidizing industry at the expense of households, continues to push back hard against these accusations. Yesterday, a spokesman from the Chinese embassy in Washington expressed, quote, globally, high-quality industrial capacity and new quality productive forces, this is a new Xi Jinping thought term, are not excessive, but in dire scarcity. How to ensure the world, especially developing countries, benefit from such capacity is a constant test for human conscience and ingenuity, end quote. The same day, state-run Xinhua wrote, quote, China has expressed serious concern over the U.S. economic and trade restrictive measures against China and responded fully on the issue of production capacity." End quote. During the talks, Yellen also warned that Chinese companies could face, quote, "significant consequences," end quote, if they provided material support for Russia's war on Ukraine. The warning comes after Secretary of State Antony Blinken told EU and NATO foreign ministers that Beijing was assisting Moscow, quote, "at a concerning scale," end quote, and providing, quote, "tools, inputs, and technical expertise," end quote, according to three people familiar with the discussions reported by UK-based The Financial Times today. They quoted Blinken as saying the assistance was particularly focused on Russia's production of optical equipment and propellants and its space sector, which he said, quote, "not only contributes to Russia's aggression in Ukraine, but threatens other countries," end quote. One source expressed, quote, "there has been a shift and it was felt in the room. This was a new development. It was very striking," end quote. Despite Western sanctions and trade embargoes against Russia, Moscow has been able to keep its economy running and scale up its defense industry, owing in large part to expanded trade with China. China's trade with Russia has more than doubled since 2020, from $108 billion to $240 billion last year. Yellen told reporters yesterday, quote, "We've been clear with China that we see Russia as gaining support from goods that Chinese firms are supplying to Russia. On their side, China emphasized that it is their policy not to provide Russia with military support. Neither of us want this to be an issue with our bilateral relationship," end quote. Yesterday afternoon, Yellen travelled from Guangzhou to Beijing, the capital, and today, Sunday, she is meeting with Premier Li Qiang, as well as the city's mayor. Next up, the worsening local government fiscal and financial crisis. If you're enjoying today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit the like button. Liking, sharing, and subscribing are all helps for the channel. And for anyone who can go that extra mile and help me keep China Update financially sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. This is a lot of work, but all your support are all incredible sources of motivation. So thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. This week, Chinese financial media outlet Caixin published a long, in-depth piece exploring just how bad the local government fiscal crisis has become. The piece argues that Chinese local governments are gearing up for another tough year and coming to terms with the new normal of frugality amid growing pressure on fiscal revenue and efforts to tackle their debt burdens. Back in March, we remember Premier Li Qiang told government officials in a special report, quote, "Prestige and vanity projects are wasteful and excessive spending will be strictly prohibited. Governments at every level must get used to keeping their belts tightened, run on lean budgets, and ensure that fiscal funds are used where they are needed most and to the best effect," end quote. However, in a recent article, Feng Chuan, an associate professor at Wuhan University School of Political Science and Public Administration, argues that wasteful spending is a feature of China's system, writing, quote, "Credit overdraw systematically occurs," end quote. He then quotes a local official in Guizhou province as telling him, quote, "We can't afford to fall behind," end quote. Then concludes, quote, "Each county chief focuses on their own achievements during their term and does not consider the long-term consequences," end quote. The authors write that other than Jiangxi and Shanxi provinces, all other regions in the country have now set their forecasts of growth in their general public revenue budget for this year lower than last year's actual growth. Han Jie, director of the Beijing Municipal Finance Bureau, recently admitted, quote, "The fiscal situation is set to come under greater strain in 2024, and it will become more challenging to strike a balance between revenue and spending," end quote. The slump in land sales revenue, previously a major source of fiscal revenue for local governments, has exacerbated the strain on budgets. Last year, land sales revenue fell 13.2% nationwide to around 5.8 trillion yuan, $823 billion, the second straight annual decline. Of the 28 provincial-level regions that have disclosed the data as of the 23rd of February, 22 reported a drop, with 9 logging slumps of more than 20%, according to analysis by Luo Zhiheng, chief economist at Yuekai Securities Co. Limited. As revenue is insufficient, it's no surprise then that debt continues to surge. Local government debt rose by a whopping 14.3% year-on-year to 41.4 trillion yuan by the end of February this year, according to data from the Ministry of Finance reported this week, although this figure does not include hidden debts, including from local government financing vehicles. The IMF, International Monetary Fund, has estimated that hidden debt as at the end of 2023 is as high as 70 trillion yuan, putting total local government debt at well over 110 trillion yuan, $15.5 trillion US dollars. Much of the hidden debt is owed by local government financing vehicles, which have 4.65 trillion yuan worth of bonds due this year, according to data compiled by Bloomberg, the highest amount on record, and roughly 13% more than what came due in 2023. We will return to local government financing vehicles again shortly. Cai Xin, in a separate article, argues that to help ease the pressure on their budgets, local governments have little option but to cut back on general expenditure. However, there isn't much room left to cut. A recent government report found that spending on people's livelihoods is taking up at least 70 to 80% of local government budgets. But something will have to give way soon. Cuts to industrial policy, or the already very limited social services, will need to take place. There is also a third option, however, selling assets, that is, privatization. However, this will mean local governments giving up political power, a politically difficult move to make. It is also unclear how much local government financing vehicles especially will make by selling their assets. As we will see shortly, the quality of these assets are quite poor. This week, Professor Michael Pettis of Peking University pushed back against the argument that the surge in local government debt was caused mainly by prestige and vanity projects and wasteful excessive spending, as the Li Qiang work report from back in March would suggest. He disagrees too with the argument that if only funding can be shifted away from this kind of spending to so-called good spending, the situation would improve. Pettis argues that this view is misguided, writing this week, quote, "In every case of a country over-reliant on investment to generate growth, surging debt has always been the automatic result once the country has invested as much as its business, financial, political, and labor institutions can absorb. The problem is not that local governments have made bad infrastructure investments when they could have made good ones. It is that the overall Chinese economy has reached the limit of its ability to absorb new investment." End quote. Now, to end today's video, we are going to examine an excellent and comprehensive essay published this week by Jonathan Sine, S-I-N-E, called "The Rise and Fall of LGFVs, Local Government Financing Vehicles." I would highly recommend the full essay to anyone interested in this space, and I'll leave a link to it in the description below. We will now quote several selected excerpts from the piece directly. "Today, there are nearly 12,000 local government financing vehicles in China, 3,000 of which publicly disclose financials. Collectively, they are gargantuan. As of 2020, according to bottom-up surveys of local government financing vehicle financials, aggregated assets and liabilities equal 120% and 75% of China's GDP, respectively. Local government financing vehicles' financial situation is, to put it frankly, very bad. In aggregate, earnings before interest, taxes, and depreciation do not cover even their interest payments. Including government subsidies only occasionally pushes the interest coverage ratio above 1. Moreover, the average borrowing cost of local government financing vehicles, 5% or so, far outpaces their 1% return on assets, posing obvious sustainability problems. Cash flows paint an equally troubling portrait. Every year, 80 to 90% of local government financing vehicle spending is fueled by new debt. On the whole, local government financing vehicles' operating inflows do not come close to covering operating expenses. New debt is routinely added simply to make up the gap to sustain current operations. As is predictable from the above financials, the shock of interest-bearing local government financing vehicle debt has just about unceasingly expanded. According to statistics from the IMF, local government financing vehicles' interest-bearing debt has grown from 13% of GDP in 2014 to 48% of GDP in 2023. Local government financing vehicle interest-bearing debt is even larger than the IMF data would suggest. An unavoidable limitation of assessing local government financing vehicles via bottom-up data, as all the above sources do, is that it only captures the 2,000 to 3,000 local government financing vehicles that have issued bonds and published associated financials. Another 9,000 to 10,000 smaller vehicles have never accessed the bond market and are therefore simply missing from the data. A simple way of trying to estimate the rest of the interest-bearing vehicle debt is to assume local government financing vehicles follow a Pareto distribution. Doing so suggests IMF estimates probably understate debt by 25%. A more reasonable, if still likely conservative estimate of interest-bearing local government financing vehicle debt is probably 60% of GDP, or 75 trillion RMB in 2023. The winds of change have been blowing, but a precipice remains elusive. Metaphorical cliffs do exist in China's weakly institutionalized, moral hazard-laden system, and Beijing has shown a willingness to push things off. Need we discuss the rapid fall of China's property developers? With the land market contracting, local officials and local government financing vehicles will be hard-pressed to keep a land-financed-based local government financing vehicle system intact. Why, though, one wonders, has there been no policy equivalent for these vehicles of the three red lines? Is it because they are more embedded in the system? Consider how much greater the on-balance sheet exposure to these vehicles is than property developers. Or maybe it's because despite escalating central regulatory action against them, local government financing vehicles remain useful to Beijing in a variety of ways. These vehicles are handy not just as shock absorbers against economic recession, nor just as levers to buttress growth and employment, but also as vehicles for carrying out countrywide goals such as extreme poverty alleviation and shantytown revitalization. But the costs of using local government financing vehicles mounts. Whether or not shock therapy comes for these vehicles, the incentive ecosystem is shifting. The land finance system that for the last 2 decades has been the linchpin for much of China's development is being directed toward the dustbin of history. Property developers have taken their hit, but local government financing vehicles remain at large. Despite the diversification, as we've seen in the holding schemes, asset structures and liability composition of these vehicles, there remains a lack of diversification where it matters. Local party state officials continue to control these vehicles and the local banks and possess immense influence over many other facets of their local economy. In a remarkably concise passage from his book, Lan Xiaohuan argues that, quote, "The root cause of the government's debt problem, and by extension the low-quality growth, is not insufficient revenue, but rather excessive spending, as the government has taken on too many roles in developing the economy. Therefore, the debt problem is not simply a soft budget constraint issue or a problem solved by modifying the government's budget framework. Instead, it is fundamentally a problem of the government's role." End quote. As a side note, we'll be exploring Lan Xiaohuan's book in greater detail next week. We continue with the direct quote. "Local government financing vehicles are the crux of this problem, and it is why property developers, most of which were private companies, have not posed nearly as vexatious a problem for Beijing. A decade ago, Beijing not only set out to constrain local government financing vehicles, but to eliminate them. Fiscal restructuring proved insufficient. Today, localities still have expansive roles. Will new sources of financing materialize, or will they be forced to abdicate? In this evolving context, will local officials face new incentives to keep their all-purpose handyman, the local government financing vehicle, alive and kicking? Will these vehicles wither away, as Lenin once promised the Soviet state would? Who will make them? With a new round of audits sweeping the nation alongside top-down inspection tours and the ongoing anti-corruption campaign, what might become of China's 12,000 local government financing vehicles? A common saying in the party these days holds that it is sometimes necessary to turn the knife inward to scrape poison off the bone. A fundamental solution to the local government financing vehicle problem, it seems, requires a deeper cut into the system. Here ends the direct quote and today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Let me know what you think about today's developments, especially the main topic, which was in part 2, in the comments section below. Have a good Sunday, enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I will see you all tomorrow.